Hi class. This week we're working on Linq to SQL. I know the syllabus originally said that we were going to be doing the entity framework this week. Thinking about it again, I thought it would be better to go ahead and start with Linq to SQL, and then we'll move on to the entity data framework if we have time. They're very similar, so if you have done any research on the entity framework model, it's not time wasted. It will be valuable to you in the future. Last week, we went over some of the basics of interacting with the database. If you remember, we created our own database file on Visual Studio. We accessed that file and then did a simple insert and select from that. This week, we're going to be doing a lot of the same type of work, but we're going to be using the Linq model to do it. If you haven't already watched the first video that I posted on the website, the What is Linq micro nugget by CBT Nuggets, I highly recommend that you go back and watch that to get a general overview of what Linq is. Linq stands for Language Integrated Query. It's Microsoft. They came out with it a few years ago. It's basically their new way of accessing databases, and it works a lot better than the old way. There's a reason why we only spent a very minimal amount of time talking about accessing databases the way we did last week, and it's because you're going to run into that out in the real world. You're going to see old legacy programs that do that. You're going to see legacy programs out there that have stored procedures that are kept on an SQL database. A lot of that is really hard to mimic in class. But moving forward, I think you're going to see a lot more Linq out there. I know all the programs that I write professionally for use in the real world, we use Linq. Just because it's fast, it's easier to write, and it's a lot more understandable. Also this week, instead of using the built-in SQL database in Microsoft Visual Studio, I went ahead and used Amazon Web Services to create a relational database for us to connect into to use. This is going to be it's going to make it a lot easier for us to write programs against more of what you would expect to see in the real world. And it's going to make it easy for me to grade those applications too, because I'll have access to the same database that you'll have access to. Just because it's a cloud-based system, that doesn't mean we're going to be doing anything special for cloud-based. This is the same way you would access any database server out there today. So what I've got going on so far is I have Visual Studio open, and I've just created a console application. And one of the windows when I first open Visual Studio that comes up is this Server Explorer window. And you'll see that I already have a couple of data connections in here. These are connections to existing databases that are hosted on another server. For class this week, you will have to create a database connection to the database that I've set up on Amazon Web Services. It's really simple to do. You'll notice that you have a little plug here with the plus sign, and that if I hover over it, it says connect to database. I'm just going to click on that, and it's going to open my add connection window. The first thing we're going to do in the add connection window is add the server name. I will go ahead and paste or put this link out there onto the Blackboard site, so you guys will be able to have that refer to it always. But this is the database that I created for class. You'll notice it's a regular URL style of address. Once you've pasted in the server name, the next thing you want to do is we need to change the logon type from Windows authentication to SQL authentication. And the username we're going to use is just class user. And I've set the password to Ivy 2014 with a capital I. And you can just go ahead and click on the Save My Password link, and it'll save that password in there. Everybody's username and password is the same. I did this because we're going to be doing code review, so we're going to need that username and password. We're all going to need to really have access to everybody's databases. So I use the same username and password. If I hit this drop-down list to show the different databases that I have set up on this server, you'll notice that I have a database with your last name in here. We're going to go by the honor system here. Don't access another person's data. Don't code inside another person's database just because we don't want to screw each other up. It's okay to access them for code review purposes, but as far as doing the actual writing of your individual programs, stay out of everybody else's database. So I'm just going to connect to Richard's database here just to use an example. So you'll see I'll select the last name, click OK, and when that's done, you'll notice that I have another data connection up here. It gives me the server name dot, and then it shows the username and the .dbo. If I expand that, you'll see that I have tables, views, stored procedures, all of the stuff that you would normally see when accessing an SQL database. I know if some of you have never accessed an SQL database, some of this will be new to you. For this class, we're really going to be concentrating on just the tables. So if you expand the table view, right now it's going to show that we have no tables in there. To add a table, it's as simple as just right-clicking on that tables and saying Add New Table. And it's going to open up the Visual Studio table creation file. If you have just straight up SQL Server Manager and you want to use that, that's fine if you know how to do that. Since I know not all of you are going to have that, we're not going to go into that right now. And it's going to take just a minute to load that window. Okay, that actually took a couple minutes to load. So when you're doing it, don't freak out if that takes 2 or 3 minutes to actually get to this window. It's just slowly connecting over the internet to the SQL server to figure out some of this stuff. So just like last week, we want to create a new table in our database so that we have something that we can read and write to. Up here, this is where all of your columns are listed, and you can create new columns as you go down. Right here, it's going to show you the SQL that you would actually be executing to create that table. So let's just create a table called my table, and the quickest way I know to change the table name is right here in the SQL. I'm just going to call this my table. You can call it whatever you want. Then we can come up here, we can add columns. It's already added a primary key for us there. Let's add a column called name. We'll give it a type of varchar. We want to allow nulls. Add an address. And let's make that an email address. And we'll add a phone number. Oops. And we'll make that varchar as well. Normally you want to be somewhat specific about the size of the columns that you're creating. In this case, since we're just testing here, I'm not as concerned about it. So I'm just going to use the default of 50. Okay, and then to add this table to the database itself, we're going to hit this update button, and that's actually going to execute the SQL script for us. There we go, update database. And there we go. It should have updated. So if I refresh this list of tables now, there we go. We have my table in there. If you're going to be doing a lot of databases, I highly recommend that you get the SQL Studio application. It's built onto Visual Studio as well. It looks very similar. This is just an example of the SQL Server Management Studio. It will speed things along greatly. It's a great tool for creating tables and columns and everything inside of SQL. So now that we have a table made on the database, now we can get into the code side of using Linq to SQL. The first thing that we need to do is we need to add our code that allows us to connect to the database. And when using Linq to SQL, that's called a data context. You can hand write a data context if you would like. However, there's a much simpler way of doing that inside of Visual Studio. If you go to your project over here, and you'll notice I created, this is just a console project that I called Week3. I can right click, we can go to Add, New Item, and one of the things that you should see inside of your item list is this data group. And one of the things inside the data group is going to be the Linq to SQL class. And this is going to create the data context for you. It's an easy tool that allows you to kind of drag and drop from the Server Explorer onto the designer, and it will create your data context. So we'll just call this my database. Click Add. And it adds a .dbml file to your project. It also went through and added some references to your project. You can ignore those for now. And on the SQL Studio main window, you'll see that it's opened this object relational designer that allows you to visualize your classes in your code. This is what we use to actually create the data context, and it's as simple as coming over to the Server Explorer, grabbing the table that you want to add to your data context, dragging it over, letting go, and it's going to do a couple of things. It's going to go out and it's going to add the connection string into the web.config for you, and it's going to add a bunch of code to the data context file. In later classes, we'll go into looking at that code inside the data context file. For now, just accept that it's there. We'll go ahead and save, and now it's created that data context. Okay, sorry for the video jump there. I just noticed that I created the wrong type of solution. When I was giving my first example there, I created a web application instead of a console application, so I went back and created the actual contents console application. And one of the reasons why I noticed that I'd created the wrong one is because I did not get this error message popping up that the connection string contains credentials and clear text passwords. You get that when you actually drag an object over onto the data context designer. When you get this message, go ahead and just click on yes, and what it's going to do is it's going to store the login credentials that you need to connect to the database inside this app.config file. This is something that your programs probably have not had up until now because we haven't had a need for it, but you'll see we have this connection string right here, and it's got the password in clear text in the in that data context, and that's what it's warning you about. For now, for what we're doing, just go ahead and ignore that that error. In the real world, it's not good practice to use clear passwords in your app.config file. You want to encrypt those so that people can't just hack your programs using that. But for now, we can just ignore that warning. So now I've created the new data context. I'm just going to save it, close it, and you'll see that I still have that data context over here. So now that we have our database created, our table created, and we have the data context, which is acting as our connector in between our program and the database created, we can actually start using that to read and write data from the database. When using Linq, the first thing that you have to do is you have to create the data context object inside your code. The easiest way to do that is to use a generic variable, and we'll call this one database. Set it equal to new, and then you just add your data context here. And you'll notice that I've called the class over here my database. When I start to type in my database, it comes up and says it wants to add my database data context. That's okay. Let it do that. That's just the auto code in Visual Studio that created that data context for you based off of our my database designer. So just accept that that's always going to have that data context after that. So we create the database data context, and now we can use that to access data in the my table. Let's go ahead and just add a row to the database, just so we have some data in there, because I want to do a select first, because selects are the easiest. So we're just going to give it an ID. There we go. So now we can write the Linq statement that is actually going to select that data. So the way Linq works is we're not actually going to be writing SQL queries. We're going to be using Linq statements to extract data from the database and put it into objects. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to create the object that we're going to store the information from the database in. The easiest way to do that is to just use the var keyword, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to start off this year using that var keyword. We don't really need to know what type of object it is. We just want C# to create the correct object for us, and the var statement does a really good job of that. So we'll give it a name, and we'll just call it my object. And this is going to be an object that we store the data that we're pulling out of the database into. And then we can actually start with writing the Linq syntax and how we extract that information from the database. So we want to use the keyword from here, and this is going to signal to the compiler that we are writing a Linq statement. We need to tell the compiler where we want to grab our data from. So keyword from, and then we have to give it a name that says this is what we're grabbing. So I'm just going to call this I for now. So I'm going to say from I, and then we need to use the keyword in to say what table we want to get that from. And the way we denote what table we're getting it from is we start with telling it what data context to use, then we use a period, and we tell it what table we're grabbing from. So we're going to say from I in database.mytables. You'll notice that I called it my table here, and over here it's plural, called my tables. When Linq to SQL creates the data context for you, it assumes that the table is the plural of whatever this is. So just accept the fact that it's my tables. Use the IntelliType there to make sure you get the right object. So we're just going to say from I in what table we want to grab. And after that, we just need to tell it what to select. And you just tell it to select, and then whatever this keyword is that you created up there again. That is the most basic of Linq statements that you can write. You can get a lot more complex than this. We can add where clauses, we can add order bys, and all of that stuff. But for right now, there we go. That's a very simple Linq statement. Now let's do something with that Linq statement. We'll say for each. So when I do my for each and I allow ReSharper to insert the code for me, it assumes that I'm looking for a collection of some sort. And it found the collection up here in my object. So I'm going to say for each my object. And really I should probably call this my objects, because this is a container that can hold more than one. So we'll give it a variable of, we'll just say x, And we'll just do some console.write lines in here so that we can display the data. And since X is a single object in the collection of my objects that represents the data that's stored on this database, you'll notice that I can select the different columns here by just putting a dot. So I can say X dot, and then I can say ID, and that's going to display the ID to the console. Do my name. Email address. And phone number. There we go. Some of you may be scratching your head right now and wondering why I'm using a loop when all I'm selecting is a single object. And I probably didn't do a great job of explaining that. This Linq statement here is not actually going to return a single object. It's going to return everything that's in the table that meets the criteria that we set for it. In this case, it's a single row, but it could be more. So for now, accept the fact that we have to use that loop to read it. Let's execute this and see what happens. And there we go. You'll see that it spit out the one record that we had in the database. If we go back into the database, right here, let's add another record. And we'll execute the program again, and you'll see why we had to use the for loop. Because here we go again, now we've got two records in the database. So like I said earlier, in our Linq statement here, we can actually do a where clause that will allow us to only select certain items in the database. That's as simple as before your select statement, telling it what you want to select, we can just add the keyword where, and then we can say I, and then dot to access the different columns in the database. Let's just say my name, and then we can say check this against a value. Just like if we were doing an if statement or something like that, we have to use equals equals because we're not actually setting it equal to something, we are verifying that it equals something. So equal to my name. You can also do dot equals and put the text inside of the parentheses. That also works. So keep that in mind. So now when we execute this code, it should just return the one record from the database. So now let's talk about inserting and updating data that is in the database. Inserting data into the database with Linq is just as easy as extracting data from the database using Linq. If you remember back to when I first started the video, one of the things that I said, Linq is really, or actually this goes back to the micro nugget that hopefully you watched on the primer to Linq. Linq is the object-oriented connection to databases. And so when we insert records into the database, we're doing it very much like we would create an object inside of our own code. And that's one of the things that makes Linq nice in the realm of object-oriented programming. So to create a new record in the database, we do it just like we would create a new object inside of code. We're going to give the object a name. I'm just going to use the keyword variable here. Call it insert object. And we're going to set it equal to a new, and then we have to tell it what we want to create. In this case, since we called this my table, we're just going to create a new my table object. Now, don't get too confused with the fact that I use table here. When the data context, or when the Linq to SQL component created the data context, it assumed that I was using a little bit more friendly name here. So, like, I mean, if you think of this was like the students table, so this would say student here, and then you'd be creating a new student, and then you'd be selecting from the students. Maybe that makes a little bit more sense. We can go over that in another example here in just a few minutes. But so we're going to create a new insert object, and we're just going to set it equal to a new my table object. And then we can change the values of that insert object. We can say .id equals 3, insert object dot my name, say this is Jane Smith. Jane. Can't type today. And there we go. So we've created a new object, we've set some values to it. Now we have to tell the data context that we want to add that to the database. So the way we do that is we just start to access the database dot, and then we have to tell it what table we want to insert to, and we want to insert to my tables. And then we just have to tell it to insert on submit, and we have to tell it inside of the parentheses what we want to insert. So we want to insert this insert object, and then we just have to submit, and we do that just by typing database.submit changes, and that will submit those changes to the database for us. Let's go ahead and remove this, and let's run that code. And you can see that it has added Jane Smith for us. And that's how you submit an object to the database. Now let's go over updating the database, another very important feature that you'll need. I'm going to go ahead and just comment this out right now so we're not inserting a whole bunch of extra entries into the database. And so let's go back to our select statement here where we've selected the objects from the database. We can do, display them to the console. We can also modify them at this point. Modifying them is simple as just accessing the field that you want to modify and changing it. So if we wanted to change the name value of everybody in the database, I can do x.myname and set that equal to, let's just set it equal to my name plus, and then we'll add updated. And what this will do is it will go through and it will modify this object and save that change. To actually get that to save back to the database, we have to do an update again, or a submit changes. So we're just going to say database.submit changes, And now it will actually modify the database for us and save the new object. So let's go ahead and run this code and see what happens. So you can see it updated those, executed a little bit slower that time. And if we finish running the code and we look at the table data, you'll see that it saved that back to the database for us. So the final type of access to the database that we need to talk about is delete, and we'll talk about delete next week. I think doing the create, update, and insert is good enough for now, and that will get you started on this week's assignment. I did want to talk about one last thing before we go, and that is going back to when we're creating the data context. For simplicity's sake, in the first couple of examples, I just used the var database equals my new database context. This is actually a bad programming practice. Something that I think we've talked about last semester. We talked about closing objects. And well, last week we talked about closing the SQL statement. This program, as written, if it were just to run over and over and over again, would have a memory leak in it. And the memory leak is that it keeps creating new data contexts and accessing the database, and it never stops accessing the database until the program closes out. And that's bad programming practice. One of the things that Microsoft did several years ago is they added a class. Actually, it was an interface to the .NET interface, or the .NET classes, called iDisposable. And what iDisposable does is it allows you to create objects that .NET can automatically close and get rid of without you using any keywords or any other code to do it. So, like, for example, when we used the connection last week, we had to do the connection.open, and then we had to do the connection.close after it. The data context implements iDisposable so that we don't have to do that. To make iDisposable fire, we use the keyword using. So right here, if I type in using, you'll see that this resharper automatically inserting code for me. It's saying that it wants a disposable object in here. It wants something that .NET can automatically throw away. And a data context is a valid disposable object. So when using data context, it's really good practice to use the keyword using and put everything that you need to do with that data context inside of these curly brackets. That way, C# or the .NET compiler will automatically close this object when it's done running all of your code. So we can just cut this and paste it in here, and you can see that it's got valid. Everything is valid now, and this will actually close the data context after we're done creating it. So in your assignment this week, make sure you do access the data context this way. Sorry if I've confused anybody on dealing with that. I was trying to make it easier to understand Linq before we really got into what iDisposable was. If you don't really understand iDisposable, don't worry. I'm not going to count off if you don't use iDisposable properly in this assignment, but going forward it is something that we're going to have to be cognizant of and pay attention to. That is it on the intro to Linq. If you have any questions, feel free to email me throughout the week. I know Linq is a very, very complex topic. We're going to get into it more next week, and we're going to get into a lot more detail later on in the semester of how to use Linq and how to use it to do a lot of really cool things. But for now, just do the assignment with the basic Linq steps, and like I said, if you have any questions, send me an email.